Cozy Tales Collective, where dreams begin and worries fade. Welcome back. As the night sky wraps around the world, it's time for you to embrace stillness. Take a deep breath in, and as you exhale, let your thoughts settle like stars shining in the vast sky. Your body softens, your mind quiets, and all that remains is a feeling of peaceful surrender to the night. Let's journey together into a story that will lull you into a deep and restful sleep. The Warden's Burden. Chapter 1. The Warden at the Pub. The Black Hart was the kind of pub that smelled of aged oak, spilled ale, and the faintest whisper of regret. It was a staple of Belgrave, a quiet district on the outskirts of a city that had long since forgotten its name in the rush of progress. Tucked between old brick houses and cobbled streets, the pub was where locals gathered to swap gossip, lament their woes, and drown their sins in cheap whiskey. At the corner of the bar, always in the same stool, sat Warden Elias Crown. A man of quiet authority, he had the air of someone who had seen too much but spoke too little. His uniform, though neat, was worn at the cuffs, the brass badge on his chest dulled by time. His duty was to keep order at Blackthorn Prison, a facility that held the city's most dangerous criminals, at least the ones that hadn't bought their way to freedom. Elias nursed his drink as he listened to the hum of conversation. But tonight something unusual caught his ear. A group of men at a nearby table spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting toward the door as if expecting someone. "Can't hide it forever. If it gets out, he's done for." Elias leaned in slightly, his years of experience telling him when something was worth paying attention to. "Not here," another man said sharply. "Too many ears." But before they could leave, the heavy wooden doors swung open, and a man strode in, Cassius Vale, a bodyguard known for his eccentric ways. His suit was an outrageous shade of plum, his hair slicked back with an unnecessary amount of pomade, and his cane, though decorative, looked sturdy enough to knock someone unconscious. He was everything Elias wasn't: loud, unpredictable, and utterly unbothered by the weight of the world. Cassius clapped a hand on Elias's shoulder. "Ah, Warden Crown. Still drinking that sad excuse for whiskey?" Elias sighed. "What do you want, Cassius?" "An excellent question. One might say I want justice, but let's be honest. Justice is a luxury in this city." Cassius twirled his cane and turned his attention to the men at the table. "You gentlemen look like you've seen a ghost. Mind if I join you?" The men stiffened. "This is a private conversation." Cassius gave them a dazzling grin. "Well, then, I suppose I'll have to make it public." That was all it took. The men bolted out of the pub, knocking over a chair in their haste. Elias groaned. "Did you have to do that?" Cassius shrugged. "Come on, Warden. Don't tell me you weren't the least bit curious." Elias sighed again. He was. The next day, Elias's duties at Blackthorn felt heavier than usual. Something about last night nagged at him. He had seen those men before, guards at Blackthorn. If they were hiding something, it couldn't be good. His suspicions were confirmed when an urgent knock sounded on his office door. Deputy Warden Rennick entered, his face pale. "Sir, we have a problem." Elias motioned for him to sit. "Go on." Rennick hesitated, then handed him a file. "I found this in the archives. It's about an inmate who was reported dead 10 years ago, Victor Dorn." Elias frowned. He remembered Dorn, a notorious crime lord who had vanished from Blackthorn's records after a supposed fatal accident. The official story was that his body had been sent to his family, but Elias had never seen the report himself. Opening the file, his blood ran cold. Victor Dorn was never transferred to the morgue. There was no death certificate. Instead, there was an old yellowed memo instructing the guards to falsify the records. Elias looked up. "Where is he?" Rennick swallowed hard. "He's still here." The basement of Blackthorn was a place few dared to enter. It was damp, dark, and forgotten by time. As Elias descended the stairs, Cassius, who had conveniently invited himself, followed behind. "This is rather exciting," Cassius said, his cane tapping against the stone floor. "A secret prisoner? How delightfully dramatic." Elias shot him a look, but said nothing. They reached the last door. Rennick hesitated before unlocking it. The door groaned open, revealing a dimly lit cell. Inside, seated on a makeshift cot, was Victor Dorn. He was older, thinner, but the unmistakable glint of power still lingered in his eyes. "Well, well," Dorn mused, looking up. "The warden himself. To what do I owe the pleasure?" Elias stepped forward. "You were declared dead 10 years ago." Dorn chuckled. "And yet, here I am. Quite the oversight, wouldn't you say?" Elias turned to Rennick. "Who kept this hidden?" Rennick hesitated. "Some of the older guards, and the last warden." Elias's fists clenched. The last warden had been corrupt, accepting bribes to smuggle prisoners out. But keeping Dorn locked away off the record, that was something else entirely. Dorn's voice was smooth. "So tell me, Warden, what are you going to do? Keep me here? Expose the truth?" Before Elias could answer, Cassius let out a low whistle. "Gentlemen, I do believe this changes everything." That night, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. As he sat in his office, a small package was delivered to his desk. No name, no return address. Inside was a single gold key and a note. "Justice is in your hands. Choose wisely." Cassius, who had barged in uninvited as usual, whistled. "Mysterious, I love it." Elias turned the key over in his palm. He knew what it was. The key to Dorn's cell. Someone wanted him to set Dorn free. Chapter 2. The Key to the Truth. The gold key was heavier than it looked. Elias turned it over in his palm, running his thumb across its smooth, unmarked surface. It was an old skeleton key, the kind used for the high-security cells in Blackthorn's lower levels. There was only one prisoner down there, Victor Dorn. The note attached to the key sat on his desk, its words still fresh in his mind. "Justice is in your hands. Choose wisely." Elias had spent years making choices. Choosing which guards to trust, which inmates to keep a closer eye on, which reports to question, and which ones to ignore. But this? This wasn't just another choice, this was a test. From who, he didn't know. The prison had enemies, sure. Crime families, old convicts with scores to settle, politicians who would rather see it burned to the ground than admit it served a purpose. But no one should have known about Dorn. No one except a handful of guards, most of whom were long retired. Or dead. The sound of a cane tapping against the floor pulled him from his thoughts. Cassius Vale, his uninvited guest, leaned against the doorway to Elias's office, watching him with amusement. Staring at a key that long won't make it tell you its secrets, Cassius said, stepping inside. Though I do appreciate the dramatic tension you're creating. Elias exhaled, setting the key down. Do you ever knock? Cassius grinned. I find that doors open faster when you don't give people the option to keep them closed. He sauntered in like he owned the place, dropping into the chair across from Elias's desk. Despite the flamboyance, the ridiculous plum suit, the carefully styled hair, the cane he twirled absent-mindedly, Cassius had a mind sharper than most people gave him credit for. That made him dangerous. Elias slid the key toward him. Any ideas? Cassius picked it up, rolling it between his fingers. Looks old, worn but well maintained. Blackthorn issue? Elias nodded. Cassius gave a low whistle. So, someone with insider knowledge wants you to open a door. A very specific door, I presume. Victor Dorn's cell, Elias confirmed. Cassius arched an eyebrow. Ah, now that is interesting. The dead man in the basement. Elias studied him. You knew? Cassius leaned back, resting his cane across his lap. I had suspicions. I hear things. The kind of things you don't find in official reports. His gaze flickered toward the key. And someone wants you to let him out. Or make sure I know he exists, Elias said. Either way, someone inside Blackthorn is playing a game. Cassius grinned. Then I suggest we start playing back. The lower levels of Blackthorn were always cold. Elias led the way, the key burning a hole in his pocket. Cassius followed behind, his usual carefree demeanor replaced by something far more calculating. I take it you haven't told anyone else about this? Cassius asked. No. Smart. The fewer people who know, the fewer people who can stab you in the back. Elias didn't reply. He already had suspicions about who might have left the key. There weren't many people with access to Blackthorn's archive records, and fewer still who had access to the basement cells. Deputy Warden Rennick was one of them, but Elias had worked with Rennick for years. If he had wanted to reveal Dorn's existence, why go through all this secrecy? Why leave an anonymous key instead of coming to him directly? Something wasn't adding up. They reached the final corridor. Dim overhead lights flickered, casting long shadows against the damp concrete walls. At the end of the hall stood Cell 0, the last and only cell in the basement. No cameras, no records, only one door, one prisoner, and now, one key. Elias pulled it from his pocket. Cassius watched him carefully. Moment of truth, Warden. What's the plan? Elias hesitated. He could turn around, lock the key away, and pretend none of this ever happened. Let the secret rot, just like Dorn had for the last 10 years. Or he could find out the truth. He slid the key into the lock. It turned smoothly, clicking into place. The door creaked open. Inside, Victor Dorn sat on his cot, waiting. "You took your time," Dorn said, his voice smooth and deliberate. Elias stepped inside, Cassius close behind him. The cell was small, bare concrete, a rusted sink, a cot with a thin blanket. No windows, no outside contact. Dorn, despite the years in confinement, still carried an air of undeniable authority. His hair was silvered, his face lined with age, but his eyes, cold and calculating, had lost none of their sharpness. Elias crossed his arms. "Someone left me the key to your cell. Any idea who?" Dorn chuckled. "If I had to guess, someone who finally realized they made a mistake locking me up in the first place." Cassius whistled. "That's a bold claim for a man whose crimes could fill a novel." Dorn tilted his head. "You believe everything you read, Mr. Vale?" Cassius smirked. "Only the interesting parts." Elias cut in. "No games. Why are you still here, Dorn? The last warden buried your records, had your death faked. Why keep you alive at all?" Dorn's smile faded. He leaned forward, his voice lowering. "Because I know something they don't want getting out." Elias stiffened. "Who's they?" Dorn studied him, then glanced at Cassius. "How much do you really know about Blackthorn?" Dorn asked. Elias frowned. "Enough." Dorn shook his head. "No, Warden. You know what they want you to know. But the real truth about this place? It's buried deeper than my cell." Cassius's fingers tapped against his cane. "Sounds like you have a story to tell." Dorn smirked. "And you're just the kind of man who loves a good story, aren't you?" Elias wasn't in the mood for theatrics. "Talk." Dorn leaned back against the wall. "Blackthorn isn't just a prison, it's a vault, a place where people disappear, not because they're criminals, but because they know too much. People who crossed the wrong men, who became inconvenient, the ones who weren't meant to be found." His gaze locked onto Elias. "Like me." Elias felt something cold settle in his gut. He had always known Blackthorn was corrupt. Bribes, falsified reports, smuggled contraband. But this? "You're saying innocent people have been locked up here?" Elias asked. Dorn gave him a knowing look. "Now you're starting to understand." Cassius exhaled. "Well, damn." Elias ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. If what Dorn said was true, then Blackthorn wasn't just corrupt. It was rotten to its core, and someone wanted him to find out. Cassius turned to Elias. "So, what do we do now?" Elias looked at the key still in the lock. The choice was no longer just about Victor Dorn. It was about all of Blackthorn, and what he was willing to risk to expose the truth. Chapter 3: The Weight of Truth. Elias stared at Victor Dorn, the weight of his words pressing down on him like a millstone. Blackthorn isn't just a prison. It's a vault. If that was true, then the corruption within these walls was far worse than Elias had imagined. He had known about the bribes, the falsified records, the convenient disappearances of certain inmates. But a secret prison within a prison? That was something else entirely. Behind him, Cassius Vale let out a low whistle. "I have to say, This is significantly more interesting than my usual line of work. Elias shot him a look. We're not here for entertainment, Vale. Who said anything about entertainment? This is a damn mystery, and you're standing at the center of it, Cassius said, tapping his cane against the cold concrete floor. Now, the real question is, what are you going to do about it? Elias exhaled slowly, turning back to Dorn. You said Blackthorn is a vault. Who put you here? Dorn leaned back on his cot, folding his hands in his lap. Officially, no one. According to the records, I died in an accident. But the truth? The last warden, Warden Sloane, was paid a great deal to keep me locked up. Not because of what I did, but because of what I knew. And what do you know? Elias asked. Dorn smiled faintly. That, Warden Crown, depends on how much you're willing to risk finding out. Elias clenched his jaw. He had spent years upholding the rules, maintaining the illusion that justice was still possible inside Blackthorn's walls. If what Dorn was saying was true, then justice had never existed here at all. Cassius cleared his throat. Let's assume for a moment that you're telling the truth, Dorn. You said this place is a vault. Are you the only one being kept off the record? Dorn's eyes darkened. No. Elias felt something cold settle in his stomach. Cassius turned to Elias. There it is, Warden. The real problem. He tapped his cane against the floor again. If Dorn is telling the truth, then there are other prisoners locked away, just like him. And if that's the case, then your entire prison isn't just corrupt, it's a damn black site. Elias turned back to Dorn. How many? Dorn hesitated, then said, At least a dozen, maybe more. Elias's fists clenched. 12 prisoners. 12 people who didn't officially exist. He had always known Blackthorn wasn't clean, but this was a deliberate operation, and it had been running right under his nose. Dorn watched him carefully. So tell me, Warden, what are you going to do? Elias didn't answer, because for the first time in his career, he didn't know. Back in his office, Elias shut the door behind him and exhaled. Cassius took a seat, stretching his legs out. So, that was a lot to process. Elias ignored him, moving to his filing cabinet. He flipped through the drawers until he found the oldest records of Blackthorn's inmates. Cases from over a decade ago. He pulled them onto his desk and started scanning through names. Cassius arched an eyebrow. You're looking for ghosts, aren't you? If Dorn is telling the truth, then there should be others like him, Elias muttered. People who were locked up but never officially recorded. Cassius tapped his fingers against his cane. And if you find them? Elias paused. He hadn't thought that far ahead yet. He kept flipping through files. Many of the names he recognized, old criminals, gang leaders, smugglers. But then, in the back of the drawer, behind stacks of outdated paperwork, he found something strange. A sealed envelope. The paper was yellowed, brittle at the edges. It had no name, no markings. Just an old wax seal with the emblem of Blackthorn Prison pressed into it. Cassius leaned forward. Now that looks interesting. Elias carefully pried the seal open. Inside was a single piece of paper, typewritten, the ink faded but still legible. It was a transfer order. Prisoner hash 626, reclassified to Section 0. Warden's orders, no public record. There was no name, no crime listed. Just a prisoner number. Elias's stomach twisted. Cassius took the paper from his hands, studying it. No records, no trial, no release, just a number. He looked up. And I bet there's more of these, aren't there? Elias knew the answer before he even started looking. Over the next hour, they searched every drawer, every archived file, and they found 7 more envelopes, 7 more prisoner numbers, 7 more ghosts buried in Blackthorn's records. Cassius let out a low whistle, laying the envelopes across the desk. Well, Warden, it looks like you're running a secret prison you didn't even know about. Elias felt a slow, simmering anger rise in his chest. He had devoted his life to keeping order, to doing the right thing. And all this time Blackthorn had been built on a lie. He turned to Cassius. These prisoners, I need to know where they are. Cassius grinned. Now we're talking. They started their search in the deepest levels of Blackthorn, the areas most guards never entered. Elias had walked these halls for years, but as they moved through the forgotten corridors, he realized there were entire sections of the prison he had never seen. Cassius trailed behind him, his usual amusement replaced by something sharper. You ever stop to wonder how deep this place goes? Elias didn't answer. He wasn't sure he wanted to know. They reached a locked steel door, rusted at the hinges. No signage, no markings, just like Dorn's cell. Elias pulled out the gold key. Cassius raised an eyebrow. Worth a shot. Elias slid the key into the lock. It turned. The door creaked open, revealing a long, dark hallway. Cassius exhaled. Well, that's ominous. Elias stepped inside. Rows of small, windowless cells lined the corridor, each one bolted shut with heavy locks. The air was stale, thick with the scent of dust and damp stone. And then, from the darkness, a voice. Is someone there? Elias froze. Cassius's grip tightened on his cane. The voice was weak, hoarse from disuse. It came from the 3rd cell on the right. Elias stepped closer. Through the dim light, he saw a gaunt figure behind the bars, clad in the same prison uniform as Dorn, but thinner, weaker, forgotten. The prisoner lifted his head. His eyes, sunken, hollow, locked onto Elias's. Are you here to finish it? Elias's breath caught. Cassius muttered, Well, that's not a good sign. Elias grabbed the bars. Who are you? The prisoner hesitated as if the answer itself had been taken from him long ago. Then, barely above a whisper, he said, My name is Graham Lorne. I was a detective. Elias's blood ran cold. A detective. Locked away in a hidden prison, stripped of his identity, erased from history. This wasn't just corruption. This was something far worse. Cassius exhaled sharply. You were right, Warden. This isn't just a prison. Elias looked down the dark corridor at the other cells and knew one thing for certain. This was a graveyard. And if they didn't act fast, he might be buried here too. Chapter 4. Buried Secrets. Elias gripped the cold iron bars of the cell, his pulse pounding in his ears. My name is Graham Lorne. I was a detective. The words lingered in the air, thick with the weight of forgotten history. Lorne's eyes, sunken, desperate, searched Elias's face, waiting for something. Recognition, a promise, hope. Behind him, Cassius Vale exhaled sharply. A detective, huh? I was expecting another mobster or a political inconvenience, but this just got much more interesting. Elias ignored him. His mind was already racing. Graham Lorne. The name felt familiar, a relic from a past Elias had never thought twice about, until now. Lorne, Elias said slowly. You were with the Belgrave PD? Lorne nodded weakly. Years ago. I was working a case they didn't want solved. Cassius leaned against his cane. And by they you mean? Lorne's gaze flickered past Elias, down the dimly lit corridor of forgotten prisoners. The people who built this place, the ones pulling the strings, hiding their mistakes, the ones who put you in charge without telling you the truth. Elias stiffened. The warden's position had always been a political appointment. He had been hand-picked for the job after Warden Sloane's quiet retirement. But had he been chosen for his skill, or because they thought he'd never dig too deep? Lorne's voice was barely above a whisper. You weren't meant to find us. Elias set his jaw. Well, I did. Silence hung between them. Cassius sighed, rubbing his chin. So, let's get this straight. We've got at least a dozen vanished prisoners, a dead crime lord who isn't actually dead, and now, a detective who went missing because he was snooping too close to something big. He clicked his tongue. This prison is starting to look less like a correctional facility and more like a dumping ground for inconvenient people. Elias turned to Lorne. What case were you working before they put you here? Lorne hesitated. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. A disappearance. Elias frowned. A murder got you locked up? Lorne gave a weak smile. It wasn't just any disappearance, it was the disappearance, the one that shook the city, the one that should have brought the entire system crumbling down. Elias's stomach turned. Who? Lorne looked up, meeting his gaze. The real warden of Blackthorn. The words hit like a hammer to the chest. Elias took a step back. What are you talking about? Warden Sloane retired years ago. Lorne shook his head. No, Warden Crown. Sloane didn't retire. He was killed. Elias exchanged a look with Cassius, who raised an eyebrow. Well, damn. That is a twist. Elias's mind raced. Sloane had been the last warden before Elias had taken over. The official story had always been that he left quietly, stepping down for personal reasons. But if Lorne was telling the truth, Sloane had been murdered, and whoever was responsible buried it so deep that no one ever asked questions. Lorne's voice dropped lower. I was on the case. I had evidence, real evidence. And then one night I woke up in this cell. No trial, no records, just a number. Elias clenched his jaw. This was bigger than corruption. This was an execution disguised as justice. Cassius exhaled. So let's review. Sloane was disappeared. Our friend here found out the truth. And rather than dealing with him publicly, they decided to, what? Dump him in a hole and hope no one ever found him? Lorne gave a hollow laugh. Looks like that plan worked, until now. Elias's fingers curled into a fist. How deep did this go? Who else knew? He turned back to Lorne. The case. What evidence did you have? Lorne's expression darkened. A list. A list of what? Lorne hesitated. Names. People who were part of the operation. People who benefited from it. The ones who ordered the hit on Sloane and covered it up. Cassius's eyes widened slightly. And let me guess, some of those names are still in power. Lorne gave a slow nod. Elias felt something ice-cold settle in his gut. This was more than a prison scandal. This was a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of power. Cassius let out a breath. All right, Warden. Here's the part where you decide how much you like breathing. Because if we go digging into this, we're going to make a lot of very powerful people very, very angry. Elias already knew that. But he also knew something else. If he walked away now, he was no better than the men who had buried this truth in the first place. He turned back to Lorne. Do you still remember the names? Lorne's lips parted, but before he could answer, a sharp clatter echoed through the hallway. Elias's instincts kicked in immediately. He spun toward the sound, reaching for his baton. Cassius was already gripping his cane tighter, eyes narrowing. Down the corridor, in the darkness beyond the cells, something moved. Footsteps. They weren't alone. Cassius muttered under his breath. You have got to be kidding me. Elias took a slow step forward, scanning the shadows. Who's there? No answer. Then, bang! The sound of a door slamming shut somewhere deep in the prison. Cassius turned to Elias. I think we just got made. Lorne's expression tightened. You need to go. Now. Elias wasn't about to argue. He turned back to Lorne. We'll come back for you. But if you're lying... I'm not, Lorne said firmly. Find the list, Warden. It's the only way you'll survive this. Elias didn't have time to press him for more. Whoever had been watching was already moving. He grabbed Cassius's arm. We need to go. Cassius didn't argue. They moved quickly back toward the steel door. Elias pulled it open, heart hammering as they stepped out into the main hall of Blackthorn's underground levels. The air felt different, tense, wrong. Cassius was the first to speak. Warden, tell me you feel that. Elias nodded. We're being watched. Then, the lights cut out. Darkness swallowed the corridor. Cassius cursed. That's never a good sign. Elias's hand went for his flashlight. He clicked it on, sweeping the beam across the hallway, just in time to see 3 figures moving toward them from the stairwell. Armed, silent, not guards. Elias barely had time to react before the first one lunged. He swung his baton, catching the man across the temple. The attacker stumbled but didn't fall. These men were trained. Cassius, for all his theatrics, moved like a man who had seen real fights before. He stepped back, bringing his cane up in a precise arc, slamming it into the second attacker's knee. The man crumpled, but the third was already moving. Elias barely had time to raise his arm before a blade slashed through the air, catching his sleeve. Pain flared, but he didn't stop. He drove forward, slamming his elbow into the man's gut, then cracking his baton against his ribs. The attacker stumbled back. Cassius grabbed Elias's shoulder. Time to leave. Elias didn't argue. They ran. Up the stairs, through the winding corridors of Blackthorn's lower levels. More footsteps followed behind them. Whoever had sent those men wasn't finished. They reached the main level of the prison. Elias slammed the security gate shut behind them, locking it. Cassius wiped a bit of blood from his lip. Okay, that was fun. Elias wasn't in the mood for jokes. Someone inside Blackthorn wanted them dead, and he had a feeling he knew why. He turned to Cassius. We need to find that list, now. Cassius grinned. Now you're talking. Elias looked back down the dark hallway. This wasn't just about Blackthorn anymore. This was about bringing down the men who built it, even if it meant burning the whole place down. Chapter 5. The Fall of Blackthorn. Elias Crown had spent his career believing he was keeping order. Now, with blood dripping from his torn sleeve, the echoes of his own breathing loud in the dimly lit corridor, he realized he had only been maintaining a lie. Cassius Vale stood beside him, his ever-present smirk dimmed by the weight of what they had uncovered. The truth was larger than either of them had anticipated. Blackthorn wasn't just a prison, it was a graveyard for secrets. A place where inconvenient people vanished, their names erased from history. And someone was willing to kill to keep it that way. The attackers from the basement hadn't been standard guards. Their precision, their tactics, they weren't just hired muscle. This was an execution squad, which meant whoever had sent them wasn't just part of the corruption. They were running it. Elias turned to Cassius. We have to move, now. Cassius, still rubbing his sore knuckles, exhaled. I was hoping you'd say that. They didn't have time to go back for Graham Lorne, not yet. The list, the evidence that had gotten the detective buried in the dark, was their only leverage, and Elias had a suspicion where it might be hidden. The warden's office, Blackthorn, had many records, but its most sensitive documents were kept in one place, the warden's private archives. Elias had never been given full access. Even after years as warden, he had assumed it was just another bureaucratic oversight. Now he knew better. They moved swiftly, avoiding the night patrols. Whoever was pulling the strings hadn't sent the alarm yet, which meant one thing. They wanted this handled quietly. When they reached Elias's office, he locked the door behind them. Cassius immediately went to work scanning the room. All right, Warden. Where does a man hide a kill list when he wants it close but not too close? Elias strode toward his old wooden desk, its drawers meticulously organized, except for one. The bottom drawer, permanently locked since before he took the job. He had assumed it was for security reasons, but now he had another theory. He pulled out the gold key. Cassius raised an eyebrow. Well, that would be poetic. Elias inserted the key. It clicked open. Inside was a thick leather folder, its edges worn from age. Elias pulled it out, flipping through the first few pages. His breath caught. Names. Dozens of them. Some were criminals. Others were politicians, whistleblowers, investigative journalists, people who had disappeared without a trace. All of them had one thing in common. They had been sent to Blackthorn. Cassius peered over his shoulder. That's a lot of people who weren't supposed to exist anymore. His tone was light, but his expression was serious. I think we just found our smoking gun. Elias clenched his jaw. This was the evidence Lorne had been hunting before they locked him away. And then, at the very bottom of the stack, Elias found something worse. A memo marked with an official seal. Final authorization, Warden Sloan. Termination order. Ensure asset does not return to circulation. Proceed with disposal as per protocol. Cassius muttered, "Well, that doesn't sound ominous at all." Elias stared at the paper. This was proof that Sloan had been murdered. Not retired, not transferred, murdered. And Blackthorne had carried on as if nothing had happened. Cassius met his gaze. "What's the plan, Warden?" Elias took a steadying breath. Burn them down. The reckoning. They didn't have much time. Elias pulled out his secure line, dialing the only person outside of Blackthorne he trusted, Detective Marion Voss. She picked up after 2 rings. "Crown?" Her voice was sharp, alert. "It's the middle of the damn night." "I have evidence of a black site inside Blackthorne," Elias said. "Dozens of prisoners off the record, political murders. I need you to get a team here, now." Silence. Then Marion cursed under her breath. "You better not be joking." "I'm not. And I don't know how much longer I'll be alive if you don't move fast." She exhaled. "All right. Sit tight. I'll bring everything I can." Elias hung up and turned to Cassius. "We just need to hold out until they get here." Cassius smirked. "You say that like Blackthorne isn't currently trying to kill us." As if on cue, a gunshot rang through the halls. Cassius groaned. "See, jinxed it." Elias grabbed the folder and moved fast. They needed to get to the security hub. If they could lock the prison down before the attackers got control, they could keep things from getting worse. They sprinted through the corridors, dodging the first wave of guards who had clearly been sent to stop them. Elias took down the first man with his baton, Cassius dealing with another using his cane far more efficiently than should have been possible. "Bodyguard training," Cassius said, as if reading Elias's thoughts. "You don't keep dangerous clients alive without learning a few tricks." They reached the security hub, just as another explosion of gunfire erupted from the entrance. Elias turned to the monitors. The external gates had been opened. More men were coming. Cassius glanced at the screens. "I don't suppose these are Marion's guys?" Elias's stomach twisted. "No." Chapter 5. The Final Stand. They had minutes, maybe less. Elias grabbed the prison-wide PA system microphone and pressed the override switch. His voice rang out across Blackthorne. "This is Warden Elias Crown. Effective immediately, Blackthorne is under lockdown. To every guard still loyal to your oath, stand down. To the ones coming for me, you're out of time. The world is about to know the truth." Cassius exhaled. "Well, that'll piss some people off." From the security cameras, Elias saw figures moving. Not just attackers, but prison guards, inmates, staff members who had heard his message. Some of them were fighting against the attackers. Others were clearly confused, uncertain who to follow. Elias turned to Cassius. "We need to hold this room. If we lose security, we lose everything." Cassius smirked. Then let's make sure we don't lose it. The next few minutes were chaos. The first wave of attackers stormed the hall, armed and lethal. Elias and Cassius took cover, returning fire with weapons from the security lockers. The guards who had turned against the corruption held their ground, forcing the attackers back. For a moment, Elias thought they might actually survive. Then, a new figure stepped into view on the monitors. Elias's stomach dropped. It was Deputy Warden Rennick. His uniform was too clean, his expression too calm, and he wasn't alone. He was flanked by men in suits, not guards, not inmates, government operatives. Cassius muttered, "That cannot be good." Rennick's voice echoed over the prison's intercom. "This is Deputy Warden Rennick. Stand down, Elias. You don't understand what you're doing." Elias's hands clenched into fists. "I understand just fine, Rennick. You think you're saving lives? You're just opening a door you can't close. Walk away now, and we can make this disappear." Elias exhaled. "Not this time." "Then I guess we'll have to clean up your mess." The final attack came hard, but they were ready. With Blackthorn's loyalists fighting back, the facility became a war zone. Marion's police force arrived just in time, securing the prison's entrance. Rennick was taken down in the final fight, his desperate escape attempt cut short by a single bullet. And just like that, the men behind Blackthorn's darkest secrets were exposed. Weeks later, Blackthorn was shut down. The missing prisoners were freed. The names of corrupt officials flooded the news. Sloane's murder was finally brought to light. Elias handed in his badge. As he left the prison for the last time, Cassius grinned. "So, what now, Warden?" Elias gave a tired smirk. "Now, we build something better." And for the first time in years, he felt free.